Story 1. I had never been the kind of person who believed in ghosts or anything paranormal. I always chalked up eerie occurrences to coincidence or overactive imagination. That was until something happened that completely changed my perspective. It all began on the first night I moved into dorm room 311 at Briarwood University. The room was modest, small, a bit outdated, and definitely not luxurious. But at that moment, it was all I needed. The walls were thin, and I could hear every footstep in the hall. The floorboards creaked with every shift of my weight, and the scent of mildew lingered in the air. I figured it was just the charm of an old building, but that first night, something felt wrong. It was the quiet, too quiet. The room seemed unnervingly still, as if it were holding its breath. As I settled in, I noticed a large, ornate mirror on the wall across from my bed. It wasn't much, just a tarnished old frame, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I didn't want to overthink it. It was just an old mirror, after all. I ignored the feeling and lay down, too tired to unpack. The exhaustion from the long day of moving and settling in pulled me into a deep sleep. The first few nights were uneventful, but I began to notice subtle oddities. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, elongating far past the corners of the room. The hallway lights flickered late at night, creating a strobe effect that made the shadows dance. Then came the scratching. It was faint at first, barely audible, like nails scraping against wood. It sounded distant, maybe from the hallway. At first, I told myself it was nothing, perhaps someone fumbling with a key or an old door creaking. But it happened again the next night, and again the night after that. A light, rhythmic scratching that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I decided to investigate, reasoning that it was likely just my imagination running wild after a long day. But the night it returned, the scratching was louder, sharper, as if someone or something was dragging its nails deliberately across the wood. A chill ran down my spine as I rose from the bed and approached the door. Pressing my ear against the door, I could hear nothing. The scratching stopped the moment I moved away. But that's when it hit me something in the room had shifted. Something unseen but palpable. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from corner to corner. Everything seemed normal. The mirror reflected my half-empty room, but there was something different. A shadow lingered near the bed, a shadow that wasn't mine. I didn't know why, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I felt as though the very walls were staring at me, waiting for something. I walked over to the window and drew the curtains back. Outside, the campus was quiet, but I felt like something was hiding in the darkness, just out of sight. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the lights on, hoping it would bring me some comfort, but it didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, the scratching resumed, and the feeling of being watched never went away. It was as though the room was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. The following days were worse. The scratching came at different times, always louder, always more desperate. The presence in the room felt closer, like it was standing just beyond my line of sight, watching me. I stayed up late, trying to catch whatever it was, but every time I turned to look, the room was empty. One night, after a long session of studying, I stayed up late, half terrified, half paranoid. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't clear, just an indistinct murmur, but it was coming from the corner of the room near the mirror. The shadows in that corner had grown thicker. They were no longer mere shapes, but seemed to twist and stretch against the light. I stayed still, afraid to move or even breathe, for fear that acknowledging the presence would make it real. But the shadows didn't go away. They seemed to crawl closer to me, as though reaching for me. My heart raced in my chest as panic began to rise. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the room, leaving the door ajar as I fled into the hallway. The hallway, usually warm and comforting, felt alien now. Silent, oppressive. It was as though something had followed me. I rushed to the front desk and spoke with the resident assistant, though I didn't mention the shadows or whispers. I simply asked about the scratching. The RA raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem surprised. Room 311 has a history, she said, almost casually. But it's nothing to worry about. Probably just the pipes. Her words did little to calm me. I returned to my room, but now, every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing. The atmosphere had changed. The mirror on the wall reflected a room that felt colder, darker. That night, I decided to leave the light on. It didn't make much sense, but I needed something to make me feel safe. As I lay in bed, my mind raced, hoping sleep would come. But then, it happened again. The scratching, this time, it was louder, frantic, almost as if it was trying to get inside. The sound shifted from the door to the walls, each scraping noise more desperate than the last. I leapt out of bed, heart pounding in my chest. My phone was in my hand, but I couldn't think of who to call. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't stay. I grabbed my things and fled, never once looking back. Outside, the night air was cold, and the dorm was silent. It felt like the world had stopped turning, but I didn't care. I just needed to be far from that room. The next day, I went back to the RA. She wasn't surprised when I told her I had left. I told you room 311 has a history, she repeated, with a touch of sympathy in her eyes. I wanted to leave, but there were no available rooms. The university wouldn't let me move out. I had no choice but to stay in another room on the same floor, but the unease lingered. I still felt the shadows following me. It's been months now. I try to avoid the third floor of Briarwood's dormitory, but sometimes I still hear the whispers in the dead of night, and I still catch myself staring at mirrors, half expecting to see that dark figure again. I don't know what happened in room 311, Was it a ghost? A shadow? Or was I just losing my mind? I'll never know for sure. But I know one thing. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't just in my head. It was real story too. Before I came to Auburn State, I was never one to indulge in ghost stories or believe in the paranormal. I was grounded, practical, and not easily scared. But all of that changed one night during my freshman year. It started like any other night. I was sitting in my dorm room, alone, studying for an upcoming exam. I had closed the window, turned off the AC, and locked the door. Everything was as it should be, but then the air shifted. It grew colder, brushing against my neck like a faint, invisible hand. I looked around, expecting to see an open window or an air vent turned on, but nothing was out of place. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired, but the chill didn't go away. The next night, the same thing happened. The air turned cold, and I could feel it against my skin. I checked the room again. No open windows, no drafts. But the unease remained. I started to feel paranoid. It was like the room itself was changing. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. By the third night, it was worse. As I sat at my desk, studying, the scratching began. It was faint at first, almost like nails scraping across the floorboards. I froze, listening. It didn't stop. It was coming from beneath my bed, or maybe from somewhere deeper in the room. I stood up, thinking it was just the floorboards creaking. But as the scratching continued, I knew it wasn't just the house settling. The next morning, I mentioned it to my roommate. He laughed it off, saying I was just stressed from studying. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. That night, the scratching came again, louder this time. It was like someone or something was deliberately trying to get my attention. I checked under the bed. Nothing, but as I lay in bed that night, I felt something new. The air was thick with tension. And then I heard it. Heavy breathing. I opened my eyes, certain it was just a nightmare. But there, at the foot of my bed, was a shadow. It wasn't human. It was tall, unmoving, a dark silhouette in the dim light of the room. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stared at it, heart hammering in my chest. When I blinked, it was gone. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, but the unease lingered. That night, I stayed up to face whatever was in my room. The air was colder now, heavier. I wasn't alone, and then the scratching came again. But this time, it wasn't from the floor. It was coming from the closet. I froze. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't want to look, but I had to. What I saw inside shocked me. The closet was empty, except for a dark smear on the wall, something that looked like a shadow but felt wrong. I closed the door, but the feeling didn't leave. The knocking started again, louder now, from the walls. I ran. I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't return to my dorm room for the rest of the semester, but I could still feel the darkness following me wherever I went. I'll never know what happened that night or what that shadow wanted, but I do know this. Something in that room was waiting for me. Something I'll never forget.